We are here for Midrash 3, which it should say up there, but it doesn't. And to just kind of review, I've left a lot of the preliminary stuff up so that we just have a chance to have it pass through our eyes again. Understand, goals of understanding what Midrash is, know where it can be found and at what times, understanding the basic processes, the purpose, what makes it different from other kinds of Jewish interpretation of the Bible. We're actually going to use a fair amount tonight of just straight translations from Sepharia, because if you ever want to find any of this stuff for yourself, Sepharia is, and we'll look at the site, Sepharia is the easiest way of accessing about 3,000 years worth of fairly traditional Jewish literature, as opposed to figuring out what book to look in and things like that. And just to talk quickly about what Midrash is, that it's a mode of biblical interpretation, so it's a process, and it is also what comes out of it, the actual interpretations themselves, and then the texts that collect those interpretations. And remembering that even if I told you that, that doesn't actually tell you what Midrash is. Knowing what Midrash is requires actually studying Midrash. And we were talking about the distinction between Midrash Halacha and Midrash Agadah, that Midrash Halacha is biblical interpretation to get you, from the perspective of the rabbis, biblical interpretation that gets you the answer to your questions about what to do, right? From our perspective, a lot of it is reading into the biblical text. They don't have that self-image, even if they're aware that they're doing that. And then Midrash Agadah is all the other stuff. And we talked about how Midrash Agadah sometimes has very weird content, but there's a purpose to the very weird content. And part of the task of studying Midrash Agadah is to ask yourself, why in the world did they talk about this at this point? And just to quickly review what their framework is, right? The text of the Torah is never wrong, it's never defective, it's never redundant, it's never self-contradictory. Everything comes out of it, they're not reading into it. And sometimes you have to work really hard to make the text consistent, right? The rabbis are going to work really hard. They've developed all of these rules that they apply somewhat selectively to get the answers that they're looking for from the text, right? Their images that they're looking for answers from the text rather than bringing their answer to it. And then Midrash Agadah kind of throws away the rule book, follows flexible rules barely ever, but does worry about some of the same problems with the text, right? The things that we see as problems with the biblical text. There's redundancies and there's surplus language and there's spellings that are strange and all kinds of other things. These aren't problems for the rabbis. They are opportunities to learn what the Torah actually says. But there's not rules that govern interpretation the way Midrash Halacha has a sense that there are some rules that tell you how to do some of this. So when we're looking at Midrash Agadah, we want to remember sometimes you have to go outside of the part of the verse they're quoting to figure out what they're talking about in the verse. And then the job is figuring out, why are they looking at this verse, right? I've called it what's bothering them, but that's not exactly the right way of putting it. It's more, what is it about this verse that they're interested in? And then remember that there's always a serious question behind whatever the really fantastical story happens to be. That this is how they ask and answer the big questions that we would expect to see answered in a more systematic way, like in a philosophy book or a kind of a systematic work of theology. They don't do that. This is how they do that kind of thinking, is telling stories and putting the stories up against each other and putting the stories up against the text of the Torah itself. So we had talked about Moses ascending Mount Sinai and ascending Mount Nebo and dying. That was one of the sets of slides that we looked at last time. And that's the end of the Torah. This is the beginning of the Torah. So we're all the way back to Breshit. So the very first word of the Torah is Breshit, which gets loosely translated as in the beginning. There's lots of explanations for why it's only a loose way of saying in the beginning. But there's another question that comes up. So here's Rashi, and Rashi's really useful. He's from the medieval period, but he's kind of reaches out to all these different midrash and pulls them into his one commentary. So sometimes you don't have to go looking around, you just read Rashi and you get sort of the history of interpretation on a verse. This is one of those situations. And Rashi has this interpretation on the word Breshit, which loosely translates to in the beginning. And he says, Rabbi Yitzchak said it wasn't necessary to start the Torah here. We could have started, but at this month shall be for you. So this makes no sense unless you read the rest of the verse in Exodus. And the rest of the verse in Exodus says, this month shall be for you the first of the months. And we start to get the rules for Passover right at this spot. So we didn't need to start the Torah in the beginning. We could have started it at the first mitzvah, right? So this month shall be for you, since that's the first mitzvah that Israel was commanded. So what's the reason that scripture opened with in the beginning? The power of his deeds explained to his people the reason for giving them the inheritance of all the nations. So this is not a great translation on my part, but basically is the Torah is talking about all of the amazing things that it says Yahweh did in order to provide Jews with a response to when they are accused of being thieves. So it's the reason for the inheritance is so that if the nations of the world should say to Israel, you are bandits, since you have dispossessed the lands of the 7 nations, they could say to them, the whole earth belongs to the Holy One, blessed be He. He created it. He gave it to those who seemed right to Him. It was His will to give it to them, and it was His will to take it from them and give it to us. This has not a ton of connection to the creation of the world, right? But it's conveniently pinned here because the question that they're exploring is, well, couldn't you have just started with the first mitzvah? I mean, this is Rashi grabbing something out of a Midrash collection and summarizing it for us. So they're ostensibly concerned about this problem of, well, why would you start here? Couldn't you start with the very first mitzvah, since the Torah is about mitzvot, right? This is the rabbi's mindset, is the Torah is about mitzvot. The whole Torah is a source of law. So why didn't we just start it with the first law? And the answer is because you have to be able to produce a document that shows how it is. You got the right to be in the land of Israel, and the 7 nations, these are the 7 nations who had occupied the land of Israel according to the Bible, right? The Amorites and the Perizzites and the, Moabites and the Midianites. There's these 7 tribes, and they supposedly occupied the land of Israel. Yeah, I don't think the archaeology really works for that, but okay. But that's what they're bothered by. And the solution is the Torah is there to tell us how we got this. And by now we're in the medieval period. So the Torah is telling us why we got it, why we deserve it, and in the medieval period, why Christians are wrong and why Muslims are wrong. because this is the 11th century when Rashi is writing. And he's writing in Provence. So he lives among Catholics. So thoughts or questions about this one?
Well,
So I'm a little confused. So he's saying the Bible shouldn't begin with Genesis, or it should?
So he's reporting to us another Midrash, an earlier one, that says we could have started at Exodus.
Right.
Why does the Torah start here? Because in theory, that's the first commandment, is Exodus 12:2.
Which is Passover.
Which is Passover. And that's the first commandment that really identifies Israel as a separate nation with a mission. And so why didn't we start there? To be clear, they're not asking this in a, wow, the Torah is wrong, that was a bad idea kind of way. They're asking it in a Socrates wandering around Athens kind of way.
Yeah.
So it's not that they really think the Torah should have started at Exodus 12. It's a, I know nothing, tell me about,
Right.
kind of a question.
Right. But then what is that psalm, which I did look up? It does kind of say, I'm giving this to you. They're not saying start it there either.
No, they are pulling another biblical text in, which is a thing they do. So last week I mentioned the title of a book, Intertextuality in the Reading of Midrash. They read this whole book, the whole book comments on itself to their mind. So Genesis 1 and Exodus 12 have something to do with Psalm 111.
Okay.
This is just how they read the text.
Okay.
I have a question or maybe two.
Sure.
Excuse me if you explained this. I was distracted a few moments ago. I don't understand the reasoning given in the last couple of lines. God gave Israel the inheritance of the land so that if people say you were bandits, you stole it, they could say the whole earth belongs to God. It was his will to give it to them and to take it from them and give it to us. Is that relating to Exodus or to starting the Torah with Bereshit?
So it is related to starting the Torah in the beginning with
Now my
Bereshit.
second question is, there was no people of Israel at the beginning. So
Right.
what good is it to Israel to give it to Adam and maybe Eve? If she had a good lawyer, she would have gotten a piece of it. But
So their point with talking about the stuff with Genesis is it's useful from their perspective. If you wanted to explain why Jews get the land of Israel by right, because that's their idea, it's helpful if you explain, okay, well, technically this was Adam and Eve's, and then it was Noah's, but Noah's descendants were bad people, and these people were bad, and these people were bad, and these people were bad, and so finally God found a people that was worthy of this land, and we need to establish property rights. And this is how we do it. This is the chain of title, is Genesis.
But Eden isn't Canaan, right? It was vague, but others, I don't think anyone argues that Eden was in the land that became Canaan.
Isn't the point that Genesis establishes Yahweh as the universal God, the God who's the creator of the whole earth and all people? And the story then establishes that the universal God, who's the God of the Canaanites too, not that they worship him, but he's the God who created them. That universal God gave that land to the Israelites. So the universal God, the king of all people, decided by right that the Israelites have it. And that's what the Genesis story establishes, that he's the universal God.
Right. This is the justification for why the Israelites are entitled to the land.
Yeah, but later on, the book does not refer to God as a universal God. It's really the God of Israel. And it actually, they actually acknowledged the existence of other gods who are legitimate gods. They're just less powerful.
Right, but that's not what the rabbis think.
But he's God, the creator of everyone. And those other gods are, at best, false gods, at worst, non-existent.
Mm-hmm. Now, minor gods, okay.
Isn't that right?
I mean, eventually that's the point that Judaism gets to, and that's the lens that the rabbis are then taking and applying here, right? This God is the universal God, created the world, gave these lands to all these other nations. They screwed it up. He's giving it to Israel, right? This is if you were buying a piece of real estate and you wanted to do a title search on it, the book of Genesis is the title. It's the chain of title from the rabbi's perspective that explains how the Israelites get the land, and then explains how it is that the Israelites were kind of forced into slavery, but now they're back.
And it says, okay, I just noticed, he's talking about the whole earth. God created the earth, and that's what so he gave them everything, including Canaan, and then they found their home later.
Right. It is useful to note that maybe Eden was in Canaan. So I don't recommend you go out and read this book, but there's a scholar of religious studies from long ago named Mircea Eliade. And Mircea Eliade wrote a number of books that were sort of about all of these. They were like Joseph Campbell's stuff, but nerdier. And so they were about all of these kind of universal symbols. And one of the universal symbols was high places, that many, many cultures view the highest piece of land that they own as the highest point in the world. And the highest point in the world is also the place where creation started. So Rabbinic Judaism absolutely does preserve a tradition that the creation of the world happened in Jerusalem. That they thought that was the highest point in the world, and that's where creation happened.
East
So,
Jerusalem, West Jerusalem.
Sure. The Holy of Holies, right? Very specifically, the story is the Holy of Holies is the exact spot where the creation of the world started. That postage stamp of space that was left empty when the temple was built and was in operation. So maybe it was Eden. Maybe climate change happened. So Michael, you've got a virtual hand up.
I find this actually very impressive that they actually see an ethical issue here. And as you pointed out, it might not be so impressive that Rashi sees an ethical issue, since he's dealing with Christians and is aware of Muslims who might be arguing with him. But Rabbi Yitzchak saw the ethical issue of why they have title to this land. And I think it's commendable that at least they saw the issue.
Yeah, and Rabbi Yitzchak is dealing with still a different situation, right? He's dealing with the Romans who have deprived Israelites of land in that thinking. So he's dealing with it, but there's there's an ethical and there's a kind of a practical aspect to it as well. But there are moments like this where the rabbis sort of let slip that they understand things are happening that they don't talk about. I did not include it because it's really not a midrash, but there is a Mishnah, right? So if you look at each individual tractate of the Mishnah as a book and you kind of cite it like it's the Bible, you get chapter and Mishnah, right? The individual Mishnah. One of the individual Mishnahs actually acknowledges how far removed the rabbi's interpretations of things are from the text on which it's based. So it's Mishnah Ocholot 1:8, in case you ever decide to go looking it up. And it basically says the laws for Shabbat and several other things are like mountains hanging from a hair. We have a teeny tiny amount of biblical text, and we have all of these laws that are hanging from that tiny thread. So they acknowledge, they're aware and they acknowledge how far removed some of their stuff really is from the biblical text. It happens. But it's very rare that they sort of acknowledge it as, it's very rare that they kind of pull the veil off and say, oh yeah, we totally understand that we're messing around with this. That's not their, they acknowledge it, but it's not their self-image, so they don't talk about it that much. So they acknowledge it, but they don't admit it, I think is how I would put it. Okay. So now we're getting down to what letter should the Torah have started with? And we're going to get to ridiculous levels of talking about individual letters today, so I feel like I should just warn you, this is the Hebrew alphabet day of the class. So one of the questions they ask is, okay, well, what letter should start the Torah? Specifically, why did the Torah start with the second letter of the alphabet and not the first? Right, and so we're asking these kinds of questions, and you can, probably some of you are, every time one of these questions is asked, you're kind of like rolling your eyes and going, really? We're asking this question? But they're interested in the question because it's telling them something about their world, or they're using it to talk about their world and their beliefs. So we have this Midrash from Breshit Rabbah. So this is the first big collection of Midrash about the book of Genesis. And it says, Rabbi Yonah said in the name of Rabbi Levi, why was the world created with a bet? So Breshit, the first letter of Breshit is the Hebrew letter bet, this thing here. What is a bet? It is closed on all sides and open in the front. Thus, you are not permitted to say what was below it, what was above it, what is in front of it, what was after it, except from the day that the world was created and thereafter. So this is the front. They think of the left side as the front of the letter. So this bet is being used as a signal for them to say, you don't get to inquire about what was before. You can,
Why didn't you start with the letter Kaf?
why didn't it start with the letter Kaf? Well, you know.
Same characteristics.
Yeah.
Kaf had not been invented yet.
Oh, I see.
Well, so we're actually going to see a midrash on the Aleph Bet today.
Oh.
So there is actually a theological kind of a thing that ties in here. So we have this, okay, it's open in the front, so you can only talk about what comes after. Bar Kokhba said, but ask concerning the beginning days that were before you. Deuteronomy 4:32. This means from the day that things were created, you may inquire, but you may not inquire before them. And from one end of the heavens to the other, you inquire and search, but you may not search before them. And then they spool out lots of other explanations for why to begin with a bet. Right, and you can kind of like go on for hours with their explanations and trying to figure out where they're getting it from. So in theory, what's bothering them is, why wouldn't you start the Torah with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet? Why not start it with an aleph? And one of their answers is, well, because the bet's closed on 3 sides. So it bounds off time and says, okay, all of this stuff forward is time as you know it, and you can ask questions about that, and you can inquire into it. But the stuff from before, you're not allowed to inquire into. So that's their solution. Jewish mysticism does not accept this solution. So Kabbalistic Judaism looks before the bet and makes inquiries into, okay, so what did happen before the world was created? There existed something. What was the something? And their answer is that God existed before the world was created. And actually, God created another internal self of God, and another internal self of God, and another internal self of God, and another internal self of God. And then eventually, the end point of that created creation. So Jewish mysticism actually says that we're not stopping with the bet. So there's already at this stage in the game, there are already disputes happening about what's theologically appropriate to even think about. Because they know that there's Jewish mysticism in their own time that's asking questions that are from before creation. So these couple of rabbis are trying to wrap that up with the letter bet and say, you can't ask those questions. And why bet and not kaf? Because the rabbis actually believe, they don't actually believe, right? But there's a Midrash that the order of the alphabet is not a matter of convenience, and it is not arbitrary. That the order of the alphabet is actually Torah. And so God determined the order of the alphabet. So you have to start with the earliest letter that you possibly can.
I guess they didn't know about Akkadian.
They didn't know about
Akkadian.
Akkadian? Well, okay, so let me think about this.
Because those letter existed before Hebrew came along.
Yeah, but I'm trying to rewind in my head to think about Akkadian abecedaries. And I actually think their alphabet starts Aleph Bet, basically. If I remember correctly.
It was not a Hebrew invention.
No. But, okay, so it wasn't a Hebrew invention, except, of course, that the rabbis think that Hebrew is the language that God speaks. So, right, their sense of history isn't there. Jack, you have a hand up.
It seems like a pretty sophisticated identification of a problem. I mean, it's a cosmological problem. It's what happened before the Big Bang. And so to raise the question seems interesting to me because, I mean, everybody has tribal myths about the creation, but to engage the question of what was going on before the creation seems pretty good to me, even if the answer is impliedly, well, we can't figure it out, so we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah, so that particular kind of insight is why, from a, if you're researching theology or you're thinking about what do the rabbis actually believe, that's what's going on behind these weird midrashic stories. Is there's a presumption that the universe is structured in a particular way. And it's structured in a particular way for a particular reason, and things happened for a reason. And Midrash is their way of getting at those questions. We would not necessarily do this. Some people in Western culture do this. Storytelling does do this. But the more rationalist you tend to be, the more you tend to want to see people write essays where they write this stuff out. And that's just not the rabbis, not at this stage in the game, it's not the rabbi's mode of communication. A Greek or a Roman might do that, but that's not how the rabbis work. The rabbis work through story. In part because this all is supposed to be oral in theory, so you have to be able to remember it, and people remember stories better than they remember 100-page essays. So, and Nadine says, maybe it was their excuse for telling people not to ask questions about what became before. I mean, it is, right? There's a group of rabbis who really don't want people studying mysticism. And this is how they push back, is to say, you can't ask. We're not going to let you. The bet at the beginning says that you can't ask those questions.
So it doesn't occur to them that one possibility is that it started with a bet because it had to start with some language, and bet is just as good as the other.
Now, they don't think it's arbitrary, or these guys don't think it's arbitrary. Now, they also have to do, I don't have this Midrash included, so I guess this is a bonus Midrash? I don't know. So I've been saying that the word Breshit means in the beginning, but kind of it doesn't. So the word Breshit actually means in a beginning. And you'll see this translated a lot of different ways in English translations of the Bible. The King James Version says in the beginning. The current Jewish Publication Society version, so that translation's now 35 years old or something close to that, actually says something, I don't have the exact words in my head because I don't have the book next to me, but it says something very close to when God was beginning to create the world. And there are Midrash that actually should be said on the same page as this Midrash, completely ignore this Midrash about the bet, and actually say, well, you know, there were 3 creations. So there's a Midrash that there were 3 creations, that the first one, the world was created entirely with mercy, and everybody ran amok, and God realized that that wasn't going to work, so he wiped out that universe. And then he created a universe based entirely upon justice. And that wasn't going to work because nobody could ever meet the standard. So then God wiped out that universe. And this is the 3rd universe, which was created with mercy and justice in equal parts.
So Jeremy, this new whatever it is, new JPS translation says when God began to create heaven and earth.
Ah, okay. I knew it said something like that. I just didn't have the exact phrase.
And Alter also says when God began to create heaven and earth.
Yeah.
But the
One,
second,
Larry? What one is?
Sorry.
What one?
Alter, Robert Alter.
Oh,
yeah, the second Midrash actually
show.
acknowledges that God is not infallible.
Hearing my phone ring. Is everyone still there?
Yeah,
Okay.
isn't that translation and the JPS in particular, when God began to create or whatever it is, that's a theological, they didn't want to say that there was a beginning for some theological reason. Isn't that what they're doing? I know that the new JPS says in its introduction that their translation is meant to follow Rashi, where there are ambiguities.
Yeah, they do say that. They actually kind of admit, and it does determine some of how they translate stuff when there are ambiguities and scholarship can't really resolve it. which is to say they go looking at modern scholarship first. And if they can't get an answer from modern scholarship, that's when they flip over to Rashi. But
Well,
even a Protestant commentary is now doing translation a little bit like this. So the New Revised Standard Version, which is a Protestant translation from really the last 30 years as well, starts with this: in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth.
Well,
So modern translation is starting to move over to this kind of like there's there's not a beginning per se, there's like the beginning of a process.
well, I should add, Jeremy, there's a footnote here that it says when God began to create heaven and earth, but the footnote says others, quote, in the beginning God created. Like it's an optional.
Yeah, so one of the things that in particular that JPS does is they recognize that some of their translations do not come out the same as the translations people are accustomed to hearing or seeing, or what automatically come to people's minds. And so they will occasionally drop a footnote that says, others say, blah, 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 blah.
That makes sense.
Like the 23rd Psalm, right? Which, you know, people, he lieth me down beside still waters, blah, 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 right? Their translation of it is a straighter translation, and then they footnote stuff in there to say, others say, others say, others say, because they know you're expecting the 23rd Psalm to have a particular flow to it, and their flow isn't that flow. So they're kind of acknowledging, oh yeah, we're doing this a little bit different. Other questions? Okay, so Midrash for everything. It is useful to know that the rabbis don't just apply Midrash to the Torah and don't just apply it to the Bible generally. The rabbis apply Midrash to almost every text they encounter and talk about, and to almost everything that they encounter. So they even do Midrash on just the order of the letters. So this is the Hebrew alphabet. These are the letter shapes for what goes into a Torah scroll if you're following the rules from about 1600 forward. With the little crowns and which letters have the crowns and what kinds of crowns and these little upticks in places. So there has been development in how the letters are supposed to be written. And this is what European custom is for writing the letters of the Torah. But what this is about is a different story altogether. So this was actually the daily page of the Talmud from about a week ago. So I'm gonna unshare this, and I'm gonna share the English of that page of Talmud. So this is what Sepharia looks like. I've been talking about the Sepharia translation. This is what Sepharia looks like. You can switch between Hebrew and English, all Hebrew, all English, and it has everything. You can find the Torah here. This is the Talmud. You can find legal codes, Kabbalistic texts. There's all kinds of stuff here. They have a translation of the Guide of the Perplexed by Maimonides. There's a lot of stuff kind of hanging around up here. And so up here, we've got this discussion. These are the commandments. A prophet is not permitted to introduce any new element. So they're actually saying that people forgot the order of the letters and that the prophets reestablished the order of the letters, which means that part of the prophet's job was to reteach people the alphabet. And they say, oh, young students came to the study hall and said things that we'd never heard since the days of Joshua ben Nun. So this is Moses' right-hand guy who maybe, according to some rabbis, is the guy who wrote the last words of the Torah. We talked about that last week. And they're going to do Midrash on the letters of the alphabet in the order that they appear. So Aleph Bet means learn, Elaf, wisdom, Binah. This starts with Aleph, this starts with Bet. So the alphabet doesn't say, what I mean is learn wisdom, but the rabbis are looking at the text and they're putting meaning in. Gimel Dalet, so Aleph, Bet, Gimel and Dalet are the third and fourth letters. Gimel Dalet means give to the poor. Gimel Dalim. And we've even got explanations for why the letters are shaped the way they are. Why is the leg of the Gimel extended toward the Dalet? Because it's the manner of one who bestows loving kindness to pursue the poor. And why is the leg of the Dalet toward the Gimel? So that a poor person will make himself available to him who wants to give him charity. And why does the Dalet face away from the Gimel? To teach that one should give charity discreetly so that the poor person will not be embarrassed. The children continued to interpret the letters. So this is the rabbis doing Midrash on the alphabet and saying that kids gave them this. Hey Vav. So Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav. So Hey and Vav are the fifth and sixth letters. That's the principal name of the Holy One, blessed be He. So Yahweh isn't the actual name for them, for their perspective. It's Hey and Vav, not Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. And they go on, right? This is like another half a page of Talmud or so, that they're just kind of start to go down this road and start talking about why letters point in different directions and why they shape particular ways and things like that.
So what would they do if the little kid comes and says, that's not what you wrote there, I can't utter it. That's not the name of God. The name of God is in the first commandment. And there it is. It starts with a yud. What would the rabbi say?
So the rabbis would say, well, actually the name of God at the very beginning of the Torah is actually Elohim. So it starts with an Aleph.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But, okay.
I mean,
So there are three. There are three ways.
Yeah, so I think the thing to know is that the students didn't come to the study hall and do this, right? This is like a retrospective sort of from the mouths of babes thing. This is the rabbis coming
A
up.
nominal student.
Yeah,
Nominal
yeah.
student would say, so to speak.
Yeah, this is the rabbis saying, oh, here's why the letters are shaped. These are the traditions we have for why the letters are shaped the way they are, and we're going to assign it to a kid. We're going to say that kids came up with this as a way to remember the alphabet. So let's remember the Gimel Daled, give to the poor, and why is everything shaped that way? Because we'll go back to this. So the Gimel is giving to, the rich person is giving to the poor person, and you do it by bending down and you have your hand extended out. The Daled's leg doesn't go straight up and down, it kind of tilts. Right, so all of the things that they're saying about the letters, you can see when you look at this alphabet. So, questions? Because I can only promise that things are going to get a little weirder.
Maybe it's irrelevant to the midrash, but why are the yud, chaf, is that right, and mem And
So,
they asked these guys, why don't they have crowns? Tet, the Resh, you
ah,
need crowns.
so there's a whole discussion in the Talmud about why the letters have crowns. There's multiple discussions in the Talmud. It's an explanation that they eventually kind of work through and give, and it's not very convincing. And you'll notice that some of them, like the Bet, the Hey, the Daled, get these little half crowns, right? So each of these little things is called a tag. So together they're tagin. They even
I
have,
mean, the first few are easy because the Aleph and the Vav lent theirs to the Gimel. That's how he has three. That's easy. Or he
so
stole them.
so if you want to know the practical reason why, I think mostly it has to do with probably readability and recognizability. Because the basic rule for the scribal stuff, I only know this because I spent separate time studying how you write a Torah scroll. The criterion for whether letters are written correctly in a Torah scroll is that you can bring it to a child who is capable of reading Hebrew but is not particularly intelligent and not particularly unintelligent, and you show them the letter and you show them the word and they say, oh, that word is X. So an ordinarily intelligent child who knows the Hebrew alphabet, you hand them the example and you say, what does this say? And if they give you the answer that you need them to give, you can keep that part of the parchment, otherwise you have to toss it out. So some of these are there to allow visual differentiation, probably how it started. And then eventually people kind of got carried away.
Jeremy, for each of the Midrashim, your slide had two questions, and the first of them was always, what's bothering them?
Right.
And so previously we could see they're bothered about a sort of sequence of the Tanakh, and they're bothered about a cosmological issue. What's bothering them here? What is the reason for this exploration?
Why is the alphabet in the order that it's in? Right, so this is not a thing that's bothering them in the sense of, there's something wrong here that we've got to fix. This is more of there's a reason the alphabet is in the order that it's in. Here is the explanation, because the very order of the letters is significant for what it means by forming words from them or forming phrases from them.
So this reflects a worldview that everything is explicable, that there's no randomness outside the Tanakh, that there's no randomness in the world, that all phenomena are explicable. And am I reading too much into that?
No. The rabbis do think that everything's explicable. Some of the explanations they're not going to be able to get to. And the flip side of this discussion of the order of the letters and their shape is going to be the rabbis having to admit that they don't know the explanations for everything. That's actually the next Midrash.
So if we looked at the Torah that we have, would we see letters like this or no? Is that out
Yes.
No, we would.
Yes. Yeah. The letters in the Torah scroll that Mahar has are shaped like this. It's a fairly old scroll at this point, so some of the letters are starting to kind of lose some of their definition. There are actually parts of the scroll where a word has been cut out and a new piece of parchment has been put in. You kind of glue it in with hide glue. A new piece of parchment has been put in and written on, and has the replacement for the word more sharply. And the handwriting is obviously different.
Right.
It's at an angle, whereas the the original scroll, everything's kind of up and down. It's a little messy. So whoever did the repair was not a great scribe.
Interesting.
I think that's fair to say about this particular person, is that they're not great. They certainly didn't have as much time on their hands as the person who originally scribed the scroll, because the letters are pretty well formed and they follow these patterns. But yeah, this is what the letters look like in the Machar Torah scroll. If you have a kosher mezuzah scroll, they probably look like this on there too, although much smaller. And it is difficult to do this, by the way. This takes a lot of practice.
Is the idea perhaps that two letters look the same, at least from a distance, and this is to distinguish two letters that look the same? Could you find that pattern here?
I think that's part of the idea. So in particular, they want you to differentiate this one from this one, right? So this one's a Vav, this one's a Zion. They kind of look similar if you squint, but then you put a crown on the Zion and you go, oh, okay, it's a Vav. They want to make sure that you can differentiate this one. This is interesting. They are not so concerned when you read the laws, they're not so concerned that you be able to differentiate these two. They are concerned that you be able to differentiate this from that and this from that. They want to make sure you can differentiate this from this, which is why they're written so very differently. This from this from this.
Right.
That's why these three are written differently. So they are concerned about it. They just have interesting ways of being concerned about it. And the crowns are there to kind of help with, okay, it's got a crown, it's definitely not a Vav. This has a crown, so it's definitely not a Mem, and it's definitely not a Samech. Right, that's kind of what they're trying to do here. This has a crown, it's definitely not an Aleph. Never mind that everybody gets confused when they're learning Hebrew because this letter and this letter look kind of similar. So it's their own idiosyncratic concerns about how the letters are put together. Okay, so we talked about kind of the order of the letters that they're gonna do Midrash on the order of the letters, right? That's what all of this has been. The poor person, the rich person is the Gimel reaching out to the poor person who's the Daled. This is the name of God. This is learn wisdom. And they keep going through all of this. And they even explain why the Reish and the Kof point away from each other. Because Kof starts the word Kodesh, which means holy, and Reish starts the word Rasha, which means wicked. And so the holy and the wicked don't look at each other. But the wicked person can kind of lean toward the Kof because maybe the wicked person can become righteous again. Really, that's on that particular page of Talmud. So they are kind of serious about how they're framing this stuff. So we've got the alphabet again, and we've got a couple of coins. And I'll explain what the coins are doing after we're done reading the Midrash that's about Moses and Rabbi Akiva. So let me share that story. Oops. I always want to go to the window to share the thing instead of. Okay, so this is another story from the Talmud. This is Menachot. Menachot is a section of the Talmud that deals with gifts to the temple and things like that. But this section of Menachot is also about the rules for writing the Torah scrolls and mezuzot and the scrolls that go inside of tefillin. And that's kind of the section that we're in the Talmud. And we have the story, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, A says, B says, when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. So all of those little tagin, the little crowns that we saw, date back at least 1,500 years in some uses. Moses said, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? Can't you just give us the scroll without all these little things sticking out? And God said to him, there's a man who is destined to be born after several generations. Akiva ben Yosef is his name. This is Rabbi Akiva. He is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounds upon mounds of halachot. So, according to Rabbi Akiva, according to the Talmud, each of those little crowns, the little dots of ink on them, the little sticks, Akiva bases laws on the little markings on the letters. So this explains, why do we have crowns on the letters? Moses said, Master of the universe, show him to me. So we're on Mount Sinai. So remember when I asked you, how do we know that Moses wrote with a tear in his eye, according to the Midrash, when nobody was there? Nobody was there for this story, right? Which didn't really happen. But nobody would have been there to see it. Moses says, show me this guy, Akiva ben Yosef. So God says, turn around. Moses sat at the end of the 8th row in Akiva's study hall. So this is like the back row of the room. And did not understand what they were saying. Moses' strength waned, right? He kind of grows faint because he thought his Torah knowledge was deficient. That's Rashi's explanation for why Moses almost fainted, as opposed to just not knowing what the heck is going on. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of a matter, his students said, where are you getting this from? And he said, it's a halacha transmitted to Moses at Sinai. When Moses heard this, his mind was put at ease, as this too was part of the Torah he was to receive. So Moses was like, oh, I'll learn it later, fine. Moses returned and came before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said before him, Master of the universe, you have a man as great as this, and yet you choose me to give the Torah. Why? God said, be quiet. This is what I want to do, right? Be silent. This intention arose before me. This is God saying, I do what I want to do. Stop talking. Moses said, this sounds a lot like Job, by the way. Moses said, Master of the universe, you've shown me Rabbi Akiva's Torah. Show me his reward. And God says, turn around. Return where you were. Moses went back and saw they were weighing Rabbi Akiva's flesh in a butcher shop. And Moses said, Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward. And God said, be silent. This is my intention. So this is a midrash about the little dots on the letters. Why do we have the dots on the letters? Why do we have the crowns? And turns into a totally different story. It turns into, why are there crowns? God wants the crowns. Why does God want the crowns? Because Rabbi Akiva will use the crowns. Well, what happens to Rabbi Akiva? A bad thing. Why? Because God wants it. So what's bothering them about the crowns is why have the crowns? The explanation is the crowns serve a purpose. Everything serves a purpose. Every purpose that's served is the purpose that God wants it to serve. Maybe don't ask so many questions, which is ironic in the Talmud. So questions about this?
Not a question, but boy, that gets pretty macabre. Weighing his flesh.
Yeah, I mean, the stories are that Rabbi Akiva signed on to the Bar Kokhba Revolt in the early 130s, and he and his students were captured, and Rabbi Akiva supposedly had his skin flayed off of him by Roman soldiers in an arena. And that's here's what became of Rabbi Akiva. But the flip side is Rabbi Akiva is probably the source for most of the laws that make it into the Mishnah. So his student Rabbi Meir preserves all these teachings, and that's what goes into the Mishnah. So they have to explain as well What happened to Rabbi Akiva? Why this outcome? So I want to show you something about the Hebrew alphabet that if I didn't show it to you, you wouldn't necessarily know how odd the relationship is with the letters as they're talking about them. So this is kind of the modern alphabet used to write the Torah. We don't have a lot of Torah scrolls from 1500 years ago, so we don't really know what the Hebrew in the Torah looked like 1500 years ago, but we know that they're talking about some of the things we see here, right? So we had the thing about the Dalet kind of not being straight up and down, but reaching back toward the rich person. We know that they were talking about the Tagin. It's already in the Talmud that Gimel, Zayin, Tet, Nun, Ayin, Sadi, and Shin will get full-fledged crowns. The mnemonic for it is Shatnez Gats, in case you ever really need to know that. So they already know which letters have crowns. That exists as part of the tradition. The rabbis also know that that's not how Hebrew was originally written. So they have a sense in the background that actually, if there was a Sinai, this would not have been how the text was written. These coins are how the text would have been written. So let me pull up. I grabbed these from a Wikipedia article. So I'm going to stop sharing that so I can share this. We have actual coins from the Bar Kokhba Revolt in the 130s, right? So 130 BCE. We actually have these coins. And we have the Hebrew that they used for these coins. And these are not Hebrew like we're used to seeing. So this is quote unquote Paleo Hebrew. If you know your Aleph Bet, you know what a Lamed looks like, you don't think it looks like this. If you know what a Tav looks like, it does not look like an X, but that's what it looks like in Paleo Hebrew. By this stage in history...
Yes, I have another screen open showing exactly that. Paleo Hebrew. Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, you're right. Yes.
Right. So by this stage in history, people aren't writing Hebrew or Aramaic, for that matter, in this alphabet very much. However, one of the decisions made by Bar Kokhba is to go back to using the Paleo Hebrew alphabet, because the Hebrew alphabet that we know today is not a Hebrew alphabet, it's Aramaic. We got it from Persia, essentially, or from Iran, from Iraq, right, Mesopotamia. That's not what Hebrew was originally written in. Hebrew was originally written in something that looks like this. These letters are sideways, by the way. They're turned approximately 90 degrees to the right. So this coin here says Lecherut, Lamed, Chet, Resh, Vav, Tav, Yerushalayim, but abbreviated, so Yud, Resh, Vav. This says Shimon, as in Shimon Bar Kokhba, Simeon Bar Kokhba. So the front of the coin says Simeon Bar Kokhba, and the back of it says to the freedom of Jerusalem. The rabbis know who Bar Kokhba is. The rabbis know that this is what Hebrew used to look like. So they are engaging in a convenient fiction to say that the Torah would definitely have been written with this set of letters. I am unaware of an explanation for why. They don't have a great explanation for why they switched alphabets. They do talk about how you're not supposed to use the old alphabet anymore. So they know what the old alphabet was. But this is the level to which Midrash goes, to say the shapes of the letters matter. The little points matter. So the level of kind of deep dive that the rabbis are doing with Midrash is one that sometimes is hard to appreciate until you realize that they really think that these points are the basis for some halakha somewhere. They're not really kidding about this stuff. And they use, even the stories about this are designed to give big picture explanations for why good people suffer. So this has been a weird set of texts, or non-texts, but just alphabet. So questions?
Not a question. I just wanted to add, Jack was wondering why they need to try to explain everything. If I understood you right, I think part of it was just because that's what they did. They most of them lived like in the first couple of hundred after the destruction of the temple, and they said they justified that there's no longer no longer temple. You no longer sacrifice animals and serve the Kohanim and all of this. What we have left to work God is by learning His Torah and interpreting it. So I think that was the rationale.
And they take that really seriously. In a way that we really don't. I mean, even modern Orthodox Jews don't engage in the level of inquiry and that the rabbis engaged in of the sort that they do, right? Because in a modern yeshiva, you're studying Talmud most of the time. You're not studying the text of the Torah, and you're not deriving meaning from these little crowns. When they're going to ordain people as rabbis, they give them study aids. There are actually books that you can buy that are the laws for Shabbat in order to get ordination, the laws for family purity in order to get ordination, right? They don't talk about the text of the Torah this way, because they're not trying to frame the world that way anymore. But this is how the rabbis did it.
So aside from rabbis, in the Orthodox world today, how would you characterize the relationship between the average Orthodox Jew attempting to live a halachic life and this body of rabbinic exploration of 1,000,001 issues? Is it antiquarian, or is there a kind of living presence of these midrashim in the life of an average Orthodox Jew today?
They have a living presence, but they don't have a living presence through direct study. They have a living presence in very kind of odd and indirect ways. So there are biographies of Rabbi Akiva. I don't really know how you write a full biography of Rabbi Akiva that's reliable in any modern standard way, because you can't. There's not a full story about Rabbi Akiva that you could put together in a 200-page book. There are all these little bits and pieces. But what happens is modern Orthodox publishers and authors pull together the stories, and they pull together all the folktales that were told interpreting the stories, and all the folktales that were told, and all the folktales that were told. And you get a 200-page book about Rabbi Akiva that tells the story of his life based on all of these legends. And baked into the legends are all of these Midrash about Rabbi Akiva that exist in the Talmud and in the Midrashic collection. So the story about Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed on a scale is in the book about Rabbi Akiva that you give to your 10-year-old kid to learn about the heroes of the Torah. So those stories are alive, not through direct consumption out of the volume of Midrash Rabbah. They are alive in sort of the body of literature that people are reading in, usually in their own modern language. In very much the same way that the Bible exists for modern Western readers. A lot of modern Western readers don't read the Bible, but they know that there's stuff in Steinbeck that's from the Bible, or they know that there's stuff in C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all that stuff that's based on things in the Bible. So it's like fluoride in the water. It's there. It's not always identified with a page in the Talmud. Oh, well, this is where that story came from, and we're going to study that story all on its own in the Aramaic. But it exists as part of what they know. And it's used, these things get used in Devar Torahs as well. So if somebody goes to synagogue on Saturday morning and the rabbi gives a Devar Torah on whatever the Torah reading is, their rabbis aren't standing in front of the congregation on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and saying, people wrote the Torah, and let's talk about how Abraham is a bad role model. They're talking about how Abraham's a good role model, and we get it from the Midrash. So that's the way that it kind of filters through, is not so much through direct study of the texts, but through all of the other things people engage in general religious life. Whereas on at least 2 high holidays in a row, I have stood up on the stage at Cedar Lane and said, Abraham's a bad role model.
Yeah, he kicks his the one that gave him the first child. He kicks him out of the desert. Not a very very nice example of how to be a father and husband.
Kicks them out into the desert. Is willing to sacrifice his child. Doesn't tell Pharaoh that he's married to Sarah, so Pharaoh marries Sarah. What else? Why is Abraham willing to negotiate God down to 10 people in Sodom, but not 1 or 2 or 3? Shouldn't you save the 2 or 3 righteous people and not just, why stop at 10? There's a lot of stuff Abraham does that you kind of go, that's not great. But the Midrash rationalizes all of this stuff. So the Midrash rationalizes the thing with Abraham not telling Pharaoh that Sarah was his wife by saying, but it's okay because actually Pharaoh never slept with Sarah. So everybody stayed okay. That's not in the text. That's in the Midrash. That's how they fill in the blank. Because of course the Torah wouldn't tell you something bad about Abraham because he's not bad. The Midrash also does things like say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob kept kosher and studied Torah. What Torah were they studying? There was no Torah. Doesn't matter. They knew the Torah. So they're not doing history. They're doing other stuff. Other questions?
What's next week?
Next week is the last week of the month. So we are doing a roundup of the Torah portions for this past month, which actually are some pretty interesting stories. So that's what we'll do. So this week's Torah portion is Korach. So we've got another week of Israelites complaining at Moses. But we've got interesting stuff because Numbers has lots of stories about people griping, which, you know, a good conflict makes for a good story. So we've got lots of stories, not any laws. So it should presumably be interesting.
Everything you do is interesting.
That's not necessarily true.
Everything I've heard from you is interesting.
Okay, because I can tell sometimes when I talk that my wife is looking at me like, this is not interesting to me. So,
How did you two go through law school together?
so when I was in law school, let's see. So I drove an hour and a half each way to school, studied until like 12 o'clock at night, and was working part-time. So actually she didn't ever see me, so she never had to be bored by any of the law school stuff, which I think worked out well for her. Okay,
Well, thanks very much, Jeremy.
Yep, thank you. If folks
See you
have
next week.
Yep, if folks have questions, let me know. I'm going to stop the